Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, friends, thank you again for joining me, Luke Crawford, on this podcast show. I'm really excited to be joined by Frank Ritchie.
G'day, mate. Can I just say, before you launch into saying who I am, it's a pleasure to be chatting with someone from Canada. On social media in the past, I have advocated for the unification of our two nations into a country called New Zealand, with our national animal being the key moose. And, a pipeline of your maple syrup coming directly from Canada to New Zealand. You can share our All Blacks, our national rugby team.
Yes, please.
I'm sure we could come up with some sort of sport that combines rugby with ice hockey.
Mm-hmm.
It would be probably the best nation on the planet, full of the nicest people on the planet.
I love that. I like, between being a Lord of the Rings fan and a big Richie McCaw fan. That idea thrills me. Unfortunately, the closest I've gotten to New Zealand is Australia, but I'm gonna have to make another stab at it. I wonder. I have no idea what the financial expenses would be on a maple syrup pipeline.
Whatever it costs, it's worth spending. Like we get maple syrup here, but you guys have the best stuff. So if we could pipe it correctly, I'd be a happy man.
100%, man. That's a brilliant idea. For those of you who don't know, Frank, who's joining me today, and it's going to be awesome. Frank is a minister in Hamilton, New Zealand at Commoners Church. He's also the lead chaplain for the New Zealand Media Chaplaincy. And along with that, he hosts a radio talk show called Total Recall on Newstalk ZB, which is actually the largest secular radio station in New Zealand. So I'm really grateful to have Frank with us. He has some beautiful experiences and some really wise insights on what it looks like to live on mission, especially in a post-Christian culture. So Frank, thank you again for joining us today. I wonder, just to start us off, I think people who knew you when you were a little kid, or maybe in high school, they might be surprised that you're now serving as a minister, as a media chaplain. Could you share with us a sketch of what your journey from childhood now to stepping into full-time ministry looked like?
Yeah, I think the person who would be most surprised would be my younger self. I had a very varied upbringing. I come from a solo parent home. My father was an alcoholic who took off a few months after I was born, and he had a string of relationships. My mother was just one in a string of relationships. And my mother is mentally ill. She suffers from mild schizophrenia, so she hears voices in her head sometimes. It doesn't quite know what's real and what's not. She suffers from what we would popularly call split personality disorder. So for her, that exhibits itself in that she will fly into a rage, but she doesn't personally feel that rage. She just observes it happening. There's another personality playing out when she's angry. And she also suffers from clinical depression. Now, I grew up through largely the 80s was my childhood, and then teenage years and early 20s was the 90s. And mental health was not understood at all.
No, yeah.
80s. And my mum got introduced to church in about 1984. And the whole spiritual movement that some will be familiar with of Toronto and Pensacola was sweeping through New Zealand at the time. And the church that she got introduced to was well and truly in that vein at the extreme end. So I remember at 5 years old, people literally barking like dogs in church. All the laughter, people falling over, prophetic words, all this stuff that I genuinely struggle with. You throw a woman into that environment who hears voices in her head, who experiences rage but doesn't feel it. And you can quickly guess how that was probably understood by these people who had no idea about mental health. So it was all seen as demonic. So we would gather around at people's houses after church, lunchtime, and regularly, I remember as a kid watching them trying to exorcise my mother, and she
Oh,
would
wow.
growl, she would vomit. At home, she was burning Bibles. Like, it was extreme.
Mm,
But somehow she maintained a faith. But because she couldn't read social situations very well, she would church hop. So it wouldn't take long for her to think she had offended someone or someone had offended her. And rather
mm,
than try and deal with it, she'd just move to the next church. So I grew up experiencing probably the whole breadth of Christianity, right from literally swinging in the rafters Pentecostal through to Baptist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic. We did a short stint
wow.
in the Mormon church when I was around 11, 12 years old. Salvation Army, everything.
Mm,
I've done it all, and I hated it when I was growing up. But I look
yeah.
back now, and I really appreciate that experience. But because I resented the whole thing, it was a really strange experience for my high school friends in
Mm,
particular, who would see me going along to church on a Sunday, going to youth group stuff and playing the part, and then at school I would be arguing with them about faith. And I got involved in my late teens with this organization called Amway. And I look back and I laugh on that period now. It was all about making money. And I
mm,
made nobody any money, but they kept bringing me along. And the group that got me involved were all Christians. And when we'd have weekend rallies, there would always be a Sunday morning service. And I
mm,
remember this one service, I was about 20 years old by then, this one service where this preacher showed a video of Jesus being crucified. And then at the end of it, he asked everybody who was a Christian to stand up. I wouldn't do that sort of thing myself now. But at the time, I stood up. And I felt this sudden pang of guilt that I'd never felt before,
mm,
like I was telling a real lie. And I went and I asked some of them who were bringing me along, why do you believe in me? You know, I didn't have a job at the time. I was doing dumb stuff on the weekends. They said, go and read the Gospel of Luke.
mm.
It's really smart because Luke's the most socially minded of the four Gospels. So I did. And assuming that I would see nothing because I'd listened to sermons and been reading the Bible my whole life. But I can only put it down to the Holy Spirit. I
Mm.
saw Jesus in a way that I hadn't before. I saw Jesus as caring for the people on the margins, which is where I put myself, having grown up in a solo parent family. Mum had never had a job. I put myself there, and I saw Jesus totally interested in people like me. And
Yeah.
I saw him bring those people into the center of the story and go to the cross for those people. And then you get the story of the resurrection. And so I thought, you know what, if he's going to do that, I'm going to follow.
Yeah.
So went along to a church thinking that if you're going to follow Jesus, you go to church. Totally grilled the pastor about everything that they were doing wrong because I still had that sense of resentment towards the church. I wanted to follow Jesus, didn't like the church. And totally grilled him. And eventually, he, I think to get the monkey off his back, said, why don't you try theological study? So I did. It lit me up, and it totally changed my whole path.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. That you have captured in a few minutes for us what is an incredible personal testimony. And yeah, wow. Thank you for being willing to open up your life to us in that way. That's incredibly compelling. And
Oh, you're very welcome. And of course, that then arcs with that change of sense of identity that
mm,
came with slowly that journey, and that what opened up in theological study that eventually arced into taking up radio, which I
right.
do now by originally a Christian radio station. Uh,
Okay.
I'd grown up my whole life saying I would never become a minister. No kid says that unless there's this sense of compulsion towards it.
Mm,
So eventually I gave into that call as well and got my theological degree and got ordained in the Wesleyan Methodist Church. And then a slow journey as well from rejecting the idea of leading a church to planting a church.
yeah.
So it's been quite a journey along the way.
Yeah. Well, can I ask, when did you plant, it's Commoners, right? When did you plant Commoners Church?
We planted Commoners in 2016.
Yeah.
There were no Wesleyan churches in Hamilton, the city
Mm,
that I now live in at the time. I grew up around this area, and
mhm.
then for to take up the radio career. We'd moved to New Zealand's biggest city, Auckland,
Mm,
for about 12 years. And then we felt a call back to Hamilton to plant a church. And we called it Commoners. I often get asked about the name. We
mm,
called it Commoners because I've largely grown up around evangelical environments that have quite a language of exceptionalism. You
mm.
know, you are amazing, you will do amazing things, you can be amazing. And then everybody who isn't doing amazing things or doesn't feel amazing feels like they're somehow falling short. But I
Yeah,
believe in a God who dwells in the ordinary, the everyday, the Spirit who's
absolutely.
here as we're washing the dishes. So we called it Commoners to try and let people know this is for ordinary people doing ordinary things every day. And those people are as steeped in the Spirit, if not more so, than everybody else.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's so much wisdom to that, because you're right. The fact that God is loving to occupy those seemingly mundane spaces and invite us to encounter him, or even to embody him to one another's in the way we rake leaves or wash dishes or make a meal. It's, yeah, in those everyday moments. Frank, I'm interested, along with your role as a minister at Commoners. I know we've touched on this. You host a weekly radio show, Total Recall, and that enjoys a pretty diverse audience, a really wide range of people across New Zealand. And I'm fascinated to know, as a minister serving and hosting a radio show on a secular radio program, um, how do you represent your faith while serving in that secular setting?
Yeah, that's a good question. Uh, well, first of all, people know that they're listening to a minister. And as
Mm,
far as I'm aware, I'm the only minister who is a radio announcer on secular radio in New Zealand. So
mm,
it's fairly unique and it's very obvious.
mm.
All the promotional photography for our show has me wearing my clerical collar, as
Okay.
opposed to today, which I gave you my
N-
Not Today
Not
Satan.
today, Satan. Love it.
Yeah, but usually there's a clerical collar. So it's very obvious that people are talking to a person of faith, but faith doesn't always come up. Um, and I reckon God, because I believe God is present in the ordinary and the mundane, and he's present in everybody's existence all the time. It's just a matter of whether we recognize, tuned in, and want to connect with that or not. And because that's my life, it's my belief that no matter what we're talking about, there's some sort of connection going on there. Now,
Mm,
sometimes that's very overt. We very overtly discuss spirituality if questions come up, or when the timing of the year is appropriate, like Christmas
right.
and Easter. But you can have someone on the air who is just feeling a little bit down about life, and offering a little bit of humor into the mix might be the most deeply spiritual thing you can do in that moment. Or if someone offers a thought, since it's talkback radio and people call in, if someone offers a thought that is off, critiquing it could be the most spiritual thing to do in that moment. So my faith is represented by just giving the audience, myself and my co-host Jax,
Mm,
giving them who we are in the mix, which is all the color of our life. It's our humor, it's our deeper thoughts about what's going on in the world and in New Zealand at the moment. It's connecting with where people are at. So there isn't this sense that when I get on the radio, I'm there to represent faith. So I have to crowbar Jesus into the conversation.
mm.
It's just an understanding that I'm Christian. This faith is part of who I am.
Yeah.
So it's going to come out all over the place without us having to try too hard.
Hmm. Which I think would, in many ways, be a relief for many listeners. I think, especially in post-Christian cultures that in the last 100 years have seen maybe a rise and then a decrease in faith in certain ways. There's a real wariness to that, to being expected to have a message forced on them. And there's something very, I believe, winsome about people saying, like, this is who I am, this is what I believe. And really the overflow of that is going to spill out in the different ways that I communicate and relate and love and serve. But
Yeah.
that's so significant. Have you ever had moments where maybe someone's phoned in and really been just wide open to your story, specifically because of your presence as a radio host?
Usually that goes on behind the scenes. So I'll
Mm,
get private communication. But in the last few weeks,
mm,
with the lockdown in New Zealand because of what everybody's experiencing around the world,
yeah.
COVID-19, coronavirus, I've done a lot of media interviews with other outlets.
Mm,
And there have been a couple of those that have asked very overt questions. Like I remember one, the Thursday of Holy Week, asking, not a believer, asking about what Easter is all about. So I had the
Yeah.
opportunity to explain that in a very overt way. And because of the relational connection I already have with that guy, that was taken really well. There was no sense of pushback. So yeah, I think it's that idea of being winsome. Many of us have grown up, and I'm sure you can relate, being taught about evangelism as this thing that we need to crowbar into people's lives. You know, you've got
Mhm.
to mention Jesus, and here's the different points that you have to bring up. There's no sense of really listening to the other person, really tuning into the situation that you're in. You just feel forced to make sure you get these points across and bring them to Jesus, rather than trusting that God actually does his work, that the Spirit is already at work with the person that you're talking to,
Mm.
and that if you're just confident about who you are, rather than being apologetic, and you genuinely care about the other person, then where that needs to take place, if we're close to God and God is working with them, that will naturally happen. And
Mm.
we're not the only part of their journey and their story with God. That plays out in many, many different ways. We're just one part of that. So we play our part in the most faithful way that we can, and then trust that God is doing what God's going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said. I think too, as you noted, there's so much to be said for what God might be doing behind the scenes to plant seeds in a person's heart and to draw their attention to him. I mean, I'm a youth pastor, and I remember one Easter being in a high school that I serve at, and a student asking me that same question: what's the deal with Easter? And I said, well, tell me, what do you know about Easter so far? And he said, well, it's about a guy who died and a bunny rabbit. and so and
That's
so I said okay, fair enough. I said, let's start with the guy who died and talk about that. But I realized someone somewhere along the way, or maybe he'd seen something on social media, had planted this in his mind that Easter somehow relates to someone's death, and it
mm,
being a significant death. And so I thought, wow, like that's the launch point that God's given me into this conversation. um
mm.
so yeah, but I respect your approach, Frank, because there's so much to be said for authentic, winsome, life-giving, loving relationships fostered between believers, and whether it's coworkers or neighbors or someone that phones into a radio show.
Yeah. And when you approach it like that, you develop permission. One
Mm.
of the things I've done a lot of reading of the Book of Acts, and I love this explosion of the sharing of the gospel that goes on in Acts. But if you explore how that was done, you'll notice that in each space where the gospel was talked about, it was done in a way that was appropriate for the situation. Now, sometimes that angered people, generally around the synagogues at the time, but synagogues were a place where you could throw ideas on the table and you could have discussion. You look at one of probably my leading example for doing mission in a post-Christian society, or a society that doesn't identify itself as Christian, is Paul in Athens, where he jumps into the marketplace where they just love to discuss ideas. So he throws his ideas on the table. Then he gets invited to the Areopagus, where the philosophers and the leaders of the city like to sit around and hear different ideas and make decisions. And in order to talk in that space, he goes, and you'll be familiar with this, he has a look around the city.
Mm.
Now, there's a lot in that city that he could critique. When you think about the Athens of the day, there would have been a whole lot of stuff going on that would make some of the excesses of our society look like kittens. Uh,
Yeah.
it would have been bad. And then he gets to the Areopagus. He doesn't take the opportunity to criticize them for everything that he thinks they're doing wrong. He
Mm.
actually pays them a compliment. Now, I know some people hear him being sarcastic here, but he says, I see that you're very religious people. I hear that as a compliment to them.
Mm.
And I see that there's this one statue to the unknown God. And then rather than going, clearly you're worshiping false idols, he says, I want to tell you about that God. And he
Yeah.
lays out this very basic story about the creator God. And he draws not on his own scriptures, he draws on poetry that's familiar to them in
Mm.
order to make his case and help them understand a little bit. And then he alludes to Jesus. He doesn't name Jesus, which is really interesting.
Mm.
And he just leaves them with just enough where some decide they don't want to hear anymore. They start mocking him. But then others are a little bit curious, so they follow and they want to hear more, which I think is a great model for how many of us can engage in society now? What do we have permission to say? What have we been invited to say?
Hmm.
And then how do we meet that space well?
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And that's a significant passage for shaping the way we think about that. Frank, along with your role as a radio host, you also serve as the lead chaplain for Media Chaplaincy New Zealand. And there's an article that came out a little while ago about you in the Kiwi magazine. I believe it's called Stuff. And the author was writing saying Ritchie is bridging the gap between religion and media influencers. And so would love to hear more about how you effectively serve men and women in the media industry when they represent multiple differing worldviews.
Mm. Yeah, I love the media. I mean, obviously, I'm a radio guy, so I love the media, and I know that for many, that's a reasonably jarring thing to hear from a minister, especially in an age where a lot of society is anti-media at the moment.
Hmm.
There's a lot of anger being directed towards the media. Whilst I don't see the media, one of the things that informs my approach is Jesus' encouragement for us to love our enemies and pray
Hmm.
for those who persecute us. It's very easy to get in a defensive stance and act from a defensive posture that achieves next to nothing. If anything, it hurts the position of the church in the world. So my sense is if there's this thing here that everybody considers to be an enemy, actually it's our job to serve and to love. And so media chaplaincy was created from this position of going, we think the media are important. We genuinely care. These are genuinely our friends. So
Hmm.
how do we serve them? And chaplaincy was just seemed like a good offering, a free offering from the Christian community towards the media, where for a lot of them, their only engagement with Christians has been emails that come through to complain to
Hmm.
them. A lot of these people have not grown up with any church contact. They don't actually have any Christian friends. And so the only way they're encountering the church is through these complaint emails that come in, quoting scripture at them, telling them how bad they are, that they're going to hell.
Oh,
Or
no.
their other engagement is when high profile ministers say really dumb things that are good headlines, good news story. And so they jump in and they share that story.
Oh, no.
So chaplaincy was a way to offer another Christian offering and service into the mix to say, here's how we really think we
Hmm.
should approach this. So it looks really simple. Apart from some high profile stuff, like when I engaged with the journalists who were part of reporting on the mosque shooting last year here in New
Hmm.
Zealand, usually it's just sitting down with people over coffee in a cafe and letting them spill their guts and talk about whatever they want to talk about. Or if I see some of them having a hard time, as has happened this week, I'll be the guy that dives in and privately gets in touch and just goes, "Hey, how you doing?
Yeah.
See that pile-on is happening there on Twitter. Are you doing? Are you doing okay?"
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Wow. Which would be such something I'm sure I would, if I was a journalist or in the media in some capacity, would be so grateful for to know if you post something or tweet something and people from around the world are throwing shots. You have someone in your corner that's coming over and saying, "Hey, I'm with
Mm.
you. I'm for you." Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Real, real,
Most of us would appreciate that, and these are human beings, and it's easy to lose sight of that. Whenever you have a blanket term for a group of people, whether it be Christians or the media, it's then very easy to dehumanize those people. But we all need to remember that even when we disagree with people, we're dealing with other human beings, and how
mm,
would we want to be treated by people who disagree with us or don't like some of the stuff that we might get up to? If we want respect and love and care, it makes sense that we would offer it to others.
right. Absolutely. And just quickly, Frank, for our listeners, because I know you developed a mini podcast series with those interviews with those journalists. Would you be able to just briefly tell us what that's called and give us a snapshot of what it's about?
Yeah, so we did a podcast series, 6 episodes called Friday Prayers, which is playing on the fact that there was a mosque shooting, and
Mm,
Friday prayers are a big deal for our Muslim friends. Um, but the shooting also took place on a Friday, and we had the sense that as journalists were diving into this, if they were going to turn to anything, prayer might be one of those things. So Friday Prayers is what we decided to call it.
mm,
And that series of podcasts is 6 journalists who live in Christchurch, and they were the first on the scenes to report what happened in that shooting. So in those 6 podcasts, you hear me having a conversation about their experience. Now, It's a worthwhile thing to listen to if people want to understand what I do as a chaplain, because there's a little bit of chaplaincy going on in those conversations. Because for some of those journalists, a year on, it was their first opportunity to share about what had happened for them and to
Mm,
process it a little bit. But it's also a chance just to get a behind the scenes look at what goes on for journalists. So there were a couple of investigative reporters that I interviewed. There was a videographer, so someone who was capturing photos first on the scenes. There was one of our television reporters who had to report live from the scene in her home city. It's a very good podcast series to listen to. And if people do want to listen to it, you can head along to mediachaplaincy.nz, and up along the top bar, you'll see Friday prayers. Click on that and you can listen to those.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Frank. I've actually listened to that series and I would endorse it wholeheartedly. It's very well done and very insightful into that circumstance. Frank is,
Just
go
on
ahead,
that,
sir. Yeah.
the article that you read out just before with a quote about kind of bridging the gap.
Yeah.
The journalist in that noted that when he listened, he was listening for the come to Jesus moment. You know, there was this expectation that because a minister was doing this, he was going to call people to Jesus at some point, and it doesn't happen. What you get is a human to human contact. So as an example of being a Christian in that space as well, and having Christian conversation, it's worth listening to too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Frank. You know, even as we're discussing this and acknowledging the tragic shooting that took place in Christchurch, New Zealand, I'm obviously in Canada, and here in Canada, we just experienced really the largest mass shooting in Canada's history just this April, which is an event that in many ways the nation is still reeling from. Obviously, virus-related restrictions inhibit certain gatherings that would normally take place to process and grieve. And unfortunately, this is something that the nation of New Zealand is not unfamiliar with. You know, in March of 2019, for those listeners who may not know, sadly, there was a shooting in two different mosques in New Zealand in which over 50 people were killed, and something that was incredibly difficult for that nation. Now, Frank, I know as a media chaplain, you were right in the midst of that, almost within 24 hours of everything that took place. You were there in Christchurch, and just to the extent that you feel comfortable, would value just hearing how you, in the days immediately following that tragedy, how you cared for the members of that community who were obviously going through so much pain, and really how your faith informed that process and your actions as you reached out to them.
Mm. Mm. My contact wasn't with the Muslim community.
Mm,
So those who, and it's worth recognizing, and we need to be reminding New Zealand of this all the time, that whilst it affected our nation, there was one specific community that was targeted. It was one community that truly felt that loss, and that was our Muslim community,
right.
particularly the small Muslim community of Christchurch. My role in it was to support the media who were directly engaging with those people.
Mm,
So that looked like me flying in. I tried to fly in the evening of the shooting, but the regional flights in New Zealand had been grounded from the city that I live in because they couldn't guarantee the security checks flying into Christchurch. So I got there the following morning once they had those in place. And what I did was really, really simple. I had no massive game plan because, of course, there was no rule book for how you act as a chaplain in the middle of something like that. Our
mm,
country had never experienced anything like it. So what I knew was a couple of things. I knew that journalists would go and find and wait where they thought they could get information the quickest. And so there were a couple of police cordons by the mosque, and so there were journalists there. And when a journalist gets into that situation, they will just stand there and they'll wait for information. They won't move. They won't probably drink anything or eat anything unless they've got another runner to do that for them, because of
okay.
the fear that if they move away, they might miss out on some information.
Mm,
So I found where they were huddled, and I walked straight in as a guy in a clerical collar, which in a situation like that just makes sense. Asked them how they were doing, and asked them if they needed anything to eat or drink. And if they did, I went and got that for them and I paid for it. And some of them took up that offer. Some of them didn't, but still took the opportunity to just quickly offload how they were feeling about the whole thing. And I also already knew a bunch of journalists in Christchurch, so I organized to take them out for coffee as well when they had a break. And they were largely in shock, jacked up on adrenaline, hadn't slept, were still processing what was going on.
Wow.
So I was a moment to de-stress a little bit before they got back out. Into it. It looked that simple. Now, as a person of faith, again, encountering anybody of any worldview who's going through pain and suffering, my first instinct is to serve. It's not to try and call them to Jesus, it's just to serve. And in my view, that demonstrates something of our faith. No matter who they are, no matter where they're from, no matter what they believe, they're still children created in the image of God. And so my instinct and desire is to serve. And if that develops some sort of relationship where deeper conversations occur, great. If not, then what they know that just happened was that a Christian minister just served them and had their best in mind with absolutely no other agenda whatsoever.
Yeah. Wow. Which is something I think so often in the midst of crisis or tragedy, or even just sitting with people who have recently gone through, say, the loss of a loved one, even if it's anticipated, to recognize in that the power of presence, and as you said, serving, just being present to the person and present to meet their practical needs.
Yeah.
I wonder in the years since that shooting, obviously challenging. The nation is healing. Journalists are working through it in their own ways, and so many people that are impacted by that. But I wonder for you, Frank, what does it look like for you to be an agent of healing within the media community? Or have you found that totally apart from you, you've seen different redemptive stories emerge from something that is really tragic?
Yeah, there are redemptive stories playing out all over the place. I think reporters in particular, one of the things you'll hear acknowledged in Friday prayers is that some of them didn't know any Muslims prior to that. They didn't know the Muslim community in Christchurch. Our nation was in terms of terrorism and the chance for anything like that to happen, had its eyes on other communities. Didn't have its eyes on the community that represented a threat to the Muslim community. So there's been some redemption go on in terms of how our nation engages with the Muslim community in particular. But not just that, wider spirituality. I think the tone has shifted since Christchurch, even in relation to the Christian faith, because a whole bunch of journalists have recognized that they know little about spirituality. So when a story comes up, they want to find the right people to be able to talk to become properly informed about that. That's where my position as a chaplain has been advantageous as well, because the trust is developed. Obviously, I become a voice that some turn to in order to understand a little more. So there's a good redemptive story there. But one of the most amazing things that came out of it, and again, you'll hear it in Friday prayers, is the Muslim community here, the Christchurch Muslim community, was very quick to open their doors and to tell their story. So usually when a crisis happens, if a journalist rocks on up and wants your story, chances are you're probably going to push them away and say, not now. Whereas these people were very quick to tell their story, to share their grief with the nation. And they were very quick to talk about love and forgiveness as well, which as Christians we should relate to entirely. So the whole nation got to see not our religious community, but they got to see a faith community represent love, faith, hospitality, mercy, forgiveness in very profound ways. The Muslim community in New Zealand could have very easily shut down and become self-defensive, but they didn't. So we had people around the nation turning up at mosques to offer flowers and words of sympathy and encouragement. And that community opened itself to that, and in so doing, helped our nation to grieve, which I think was beautiful. It was a good example of faith.
Extraordinary, really. Wow. Yeah, and a beautiful way to step into, real relationships across faith or maybe even ethnic divides. Wow, that would take a lot of courage. But thank you. I'm grateful you've highlighted that and shared that with us. Um, Frank, I'm thinking ahead a little bit and reflecting on what you shared already in our time together, and both your insights just a moment ago with regards to Christchurch, but even before that, your own journey and what it's meant for you to be a minister and a radio show host. And just in looking ahead over the next few questions, I'd love to consider some of your wisdom, invite your feedback for those of us who are listening and thinking in a really practical, applicable way about what it might look like for them to embrace some of the good things that you've modeled in your own ministry and your own practice in their own lives. I know one journalist quotes you as saying, quote, "I don't like church becoming an insular affair. I like the idea of faith being something that interacts. If what I believe is the truth, then there's an element where it's true for everybody. My challenge is to communicate it," end quote. And so as you continue to live and serve in what I think is fair to say is an increasingly post-Christian culture, I know we feel that here in Canada, what would you say is vital for Christians to know and to demonstrate in their lives?
I think it would be vital to understand that the deeper things we believe in, the story that we believe in, is true, and
Yeah,
to really hold that it's true. Outside of the political stuff that can easily be wrangled about, that deeper story of Jesus is true. And if it's true, then it will land with people if it's communicated well. Most people, you get your trolls who are never gonna want the discussion, but for most people, it lands in some way. And so then part of the challenge for us is to work out how to communicate that, and sometimes doing so in creative ways. I'll give you an example. There was one of Auckland's best cafes, Crave Cafe, which is run by a Christian collective. It's one of the most popular cafes in Auckland. Had a guy came and talked to me, and he talked about the idea during a summer of setting up just for a day a confessional booth, where for most of us, even those of us who've grown up Christian, the idea of some sort of personal confession is something we'd probably run away from.
hmm.
But I personally think confession is a really important and valid,
Really
healthy thing
healthy.
to
Yeah.
do. And so we set up this booth in this cafe that has hundreds of people come through it in a day. We had me sitting on one side, and anybody could walk in and sit down on the other side and offer their confession, whatever that was going to be. Again, no come to Jesus moment, just this place where we believed that this idea of talking about your stuff and letting it go would be a very connective human experience, because our faith is deeply human.
Hmm.
And people came in, largely veiled, so they could see me through a grate if they got down and had a look. But otherwise, they were just confessing their stuff to some anonymous person on the other side, some minister. There's a profile of me outside. So they would come in and share stuff. And it was amazing what got shared in that space with people who
Wow.
were telling me stuff they'd never told anybody before. And even the people who didn't have the courage to come in, we had someone just monitoring the conversations that were going on outside, jumping in if he felt like he needed to. And there were friends talking to other friends about what they would say if they did come into the booth. So
Hmm.
there were really healthy conversations with friends hearing stuff from other friends that they hadn't heard before, and the type of vulnerability that goes along with that. So it was finding one of those things in our own tradition that is human, and finding a way to connect that with others.
Hmm.
Same with Ash Wednesday is a big thing in my tradition, and
Hmm.
that wonderful signing of the cross,
Hmm.
and hearing the words, "Remember, O mortal, that you are dust, and to dust you will return." In an age where we're all about chasing youth and beauty and wanting to live forever, that's a deeply freeing statement if it's explained to you well. So I know a number of ministers who have gone out into the streets, they've gone out into public squares, and they've offered that, and it's been a really meaningful experience for people. Again, it's just finding those ways to connect who we are and what it is that we believe in a manner that is serving other people, rather than just trying to drag them across to our space, that then enables other people to connect with it. Now, they might not have their conversion moment right there and then, but they've just been given a different way to engage and think about the Christian faith, and who knows where that might lead. For some, it won't lead anywhere. For others, it could lead to something very meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be willing to engage them on their turf in many ways is a
Yeah.
beautiful starting point. Those are
Yeah, it's finding that way to get faith out there in a way that is relevant to people
Mm,
and serves people outside of our church.
mhm. And especially, I like your example of that confession booth. That would be extraordinary to set up a confession booth in a coffee shop, but
Mm.
to realize that we're inviting people to consider participating in doing something that actually meets a soul need. Like you said, confession being rich and a very healthy practice, even though it can be intimidating and hard sometimes, and realizing that that even just draws people's awareness to like, oh, like this is feeding a soul need I maybe didn't even know I had.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, so
Yeah,
valuable.
it's worth thinking through a lot of it, what it is that we believe and think and do,
Mm,
not as Christian, but as human.
mm,
So if, say, confession is not a Christian thing, it's a human thing, then how do we engage that in a human space? If Holy Communion is not just a Christian thing, but a human thing, how
mm.
do we engage that in a Christian, in a human space? If prayer is not just a Christian thing, but a human thing, how do we communicate that to humans who might not necessarily believe as we do? But if it's human, we should be able to find ways where it connects somehow.
I think you need to write a book on that. That's a powerful insight. It invites people to see that they're most human in those moments.
Mm,
Yeah, well said. Well said. Considering though, for some of our listeners, especially some of our youth and young adults, or even anyone in the age spectrum who finds themselves in a community or a workplace where at times they face antagonism from peers or teachers or maybe coworkers when they've shared their faith on hot topic issues, something's come up and they've just been honest about their stance on something, say abortion. They happen to be pro-life and they're with people who are pro-choice, and they face a certain degree of animosity as a result of that. Um, how would you coach those listening
mm,
to interact with or respond to people who don't share their worldview, and even to how you might encourage them to see themselves as Christian influencers who are influencing cultural influencers, if that makes sense?
mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we've got to pick our times.
Mm,
I think that's first. Sometimes it's actually not worth offering our opinion on something
mm,
into the mix, or it might not be helpful. And then in those instances, it's actually okay to say nothing. We don't have to get the right opinion on the table. But then there are times where we might be able to, or we've got the sort of relationship that allows us to. And then working out, rather than just how do I get my opinion across here, working out how do I help this land for this other person, even if at the end of the day we're still going to disagree,
mm,
is the question to ask. So that's what's going on every time I do an interview. And I've been asked about the abortion question, and I've managed to offer an explanation that I remember someone else on that show disagreeing with, but they got it. What I talked about was holding to a consistent life ethic. So rather than dealing with the abortion issue, I took it higher
mm,
to what my overarching value system is, that then informs what I think about something like abortion.
mm,
And I said, I have a consistent life ethic. So I said, my instinct is to want to encourage human flourishing from the moment of conception to natural death. Use
mm.
the phrase natural death because euthanasia is a big topic in New Zealand now.
Yes, yeah.
And I said, I'm for human flourishing right along that spectrum. So that means I support social welfare. I support everything that would enable people to live well in the here and now. They said, I am against war. I will promote voices of peace. I am against the death penalty. So by saying all that first, I've
Mm,
got them on things that I know we agree on. And then I'll say, and so that when it comes to how life begins, I want to encourage human life. Now that I take into account all the messiness and all the complications of life right there, but I
yeah.
want my instinct to be to encourage life. At the other end, I want to be caring for our most vulnerable. I want them to know that they're not alone, and that they
Mm,
have the most care that we could possibly give them. So my instinct would be to offer palliative care, and for our nation to invest heavily into that.
yeah.
So my instinct is for life. Now you finish there. I haven't said I'm against abortion. All I've done is gone, here's the overarching value system that informs how I approach all of these things. I'll say, so I struggle with abortion and I struggle with euthanasia, but it's because I want our instinct to be human flourishing. It's finding that overarching narrative and not just buying into the argument that's on the table in front of us and thinking that we have to offer our opinion into that. There are always other ways to engage in these discussions.
Yeah. Wow. That is a really wise way to approach that, Frank. Thank you for taking that example and giving us a really practical illustration through that. I've learned from that. To be honest, I've learned from our whole time together. I'm very grateful to you both for being willing to be a part of this and then juggling the 16-hour time difference that exists between Canada and New Zealand.
Hey, just out of interest, what's the time? Like, I know that this is not going to be playing out live for people, but what's the time where you are?
So it's 10 to 6 in the evening.
Okay, so it's 9 a.m. It's just gone. It's almost coming up 10 a.m. So actually, I'm at the start of my workday, so it's very easy for me.
There you go. Well, it works out well. So thank you, Frank. Super grateful to have you with us. I know there's a lot of ways that you have presence online, and would love to for those who are listening to have the chance to get connected with you, to check into your show, to read some of your blog. Would you be able to give us some more information about how we could get connected with you?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different ways. I have a website because Frank is short for francis-ritchie.com, and the Ritchie has a T in it. And then you can find me on Twitter. Twitter in New Zealand, it gets used in different ways around the world, but in New Zealand, it's largely where journalists spend all their time. Media people, PR people, marketing people, they're all there. So in order to engage with journalists in social media, I spend a lot of time on Twitter. And you just search for Frank Ritchie, look for the guy in the collar, and that'll be me. On Facebook, just search for Francis Ritchie again. You'll see the guy in the collar. That's my public page. That's the best place to engage. Instagram, I think, as well. I'm all over the place.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, Frank, for that. And thank you again for all that you've contributed today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And thank you. It's an honor to be on this side of the world and be invited to speak into a group on the other side of the world. And obviously one of the best nations in the world. I've done a few interviews. I usually keep quiet and want to think about the countries that I'm talking to, but Canada, like I said at the beginning, we need to get together.
Well, the feeling is mutual. So thank you.